The delineation of comic book history into specific ages is intrinsically tied to the superhero genre. This mainly occurs because that genre is directly associated with comic books. After all, it was the creation of superheroes that made a new medium unique and distinct from its newspaper origins. Of course, superheroes haven't always been the dominant genre, but they have been a steady presence since the very beginning of the medium. So it's no surprise that notable events in superhero history are what begins certain comic book ages. These are somewhat arbitrary points, but there is a reasoning behind them. There are other influential events that directly or indirectly affected the evolution of comic books from a primarily juvenile medium to its current state as a respectable method of artistic expression. Instead of focusing on one genre and its impact, this will contain many of the notable or significant developments of the medium. Finding a definitive beginning to the Bronze Age is a heavily debated topic. And for good reason. A lot happened in a very short amount of time. Marvel began publishing Conan the Barbarian in 1970, the first of many licensed properties the company would publish. In 1971, they also published the three-part Green Goblin Reborn, which focused on drug addiction. In 1970, DC began publishing the acclaimed Green Lantern Green Arrow series by Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams. This was a series that also dealt with drug addiction and a variety of social issues. At the same time, Jack Kirby left Marvel Comics and began his fourth world epic at DC. Finally, in 1971, the Comics Code was revised to allow for overt supernatural elements to be depicted in the medium once again. Of all the developments that define the beginning of this era, this may be the most important. Although, one can't overlook the events that preceded this revision because they certainly had an influence on it. Without Marvel and DC pushing back against the restrictions, they might not have been relaxed. With the revised code in place, both Marvel and DC began expanding the variety of their output to include previously forbidden elements. Perhaps Marvel was the boldest, creating characters such as the demonic Ghost Rider, the science-based vampire, Morbius, the muck-encrusted monstrosity, Man-Thing, and the literal son of Satan, to name but a few examples. Eventually, DC would try to challenge Marvel's dominance on the newsstand with something called the DC Explosion. They aggressively published a variety of new titles between 1975 and 1978, hoping to crush their rival with new concepts and a higher profile. Unfortunately, interest in comics had waned, and this approach almost destroyed DC. In 1978, DC abruptly cancelled roughly 40% of its titles in an event known as the DC Implosion. It was a reasonably unstable time for the company. However, Marvel was in no position to gloat. Not only were their sales equally dismal, but the company had been running wild without a consistent editor-in-chief since 1972. The publisher wasn't in dire straits like their rival, but it was functioning without a direction. This would change in 1978 when Jim Shooter was hired as editor-in-chief. In retrospect, this controversial figure was exactly what Marvel needed as the company headed into the 80s. He instituted changes that stabilized the company and expanded its presence. But, to some, he was a micromanaging dictator with a narrow view of how to produce a comic. This led to a certain amount of creative talent vocally leaving Marvel and begin working for DC. Another defining feature of this age is the beginning stages of a discussion around creators' rights. Since the inception of the industry, artists and writers were merely hired hands. Everything they did was owned outright by the companies they worked for. This was in stark contrast to nearly every other publishing venture, where the creator of the work owned the rights to the material they produced. The change began when the highly successful artist, Neil Adams, discovered that the creators of Superman, Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, were living in poverty. The two people who had created the most influential character in the history of comics did not share in that success. They were treated as nobodies due to the fact that they had tried to legally reacquire their rights to Superman in the late 60s. It was further discovered they had originally been coerced into signing away their rights without legal counsel. It was a very shady deal that, unfortunately, had been upheld in a court of law. Adams brought Siegel and Shuster's story to the public. He was rather vocal about their deplorable state of affairs and how they'd been mistreated by DC. With a big-budget Superman movie in production, DC had to manage this negative press. Over at Marvel, Steve Gerber, the creator of Howard the Duck, pursued legal action to decide the ownership of that character. At roughly the same time, Jack Kirby also began negotiations to have his artwork returned to him from the Marvel archives. Gerber would eventually lose his case, and Kirby would spend the next decade legally arguing with Marvel to obtain his artwork. These three instances are very complex and very convoluted, and they were public matters that were adjudicated by the court of popular opinion, but they contributed to opening a discussion about creators' rights, and most importantly, to provide compensation for the creators if their work became popular and profitable. Finally, the Bronze Age included three important interrelated elements: the opening of comic book specialty stores, the creation of direct market distribution, and the return of alternative comics. In the beginning stages, all three depended on one another. With this new model, alternative comics such as Starreach, ElfQuest, and Cerebus could get their material to an audience since traditional distribution wasn't available to them. Comic book stores had a direct method of obtaining the product to sustain their business, and the distributors had a growing market to distribute to. What made this model successful and gave incentive to Marvel and DC to use this method was the fact that every issue ordered was a guaranteed sale. With traditional distribution, newsstands could return whatever they ordered if it didn't sell. Comic book stores did not have that option. In return, comic book stores paid a lower price for the comics they ordered. Also, the direct market didn't require approval of the Comics Code Authority for the titles it carried. Unofficially, the direct market would reject titles if they were deemed objectionable, but there was no official censorship board monitoring every title, so its decisions could be, at times, inconsistent. The early 80s is when the direct market began to rapidly inflate. New publishers, such as Pacific Comics, First Comics, Eclipse, and Comico, started up and found success. In 1984, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles began, and an explosion of black and white titles followed, many of which had an anthropomorphic spin like the Turtles. Regardless, the success of the Turtles brought attention to alternative titles, and readers became more willing to try out unproven works by new talent. The black and white explosion may have been brief, but its effect was long-lasting. At the same time, Marvel and DC were tentatively testing the market with direct market exclusive titles. When very healthy orders came in for these exclusive titles, both began to commit to this new model. In fact, Marvel committed heavily, leading to many of the smaller publishers complaining that Marvel was trying to drown them out with an avalanche of new material. That is, with Marvel's notoriety and their wide selection of titles, they would have a larger presence in comic book stores. And a store was more likely to order a Marvel comic due to its general appeal, rather than an alternative comic with a limited audience. Not to mention, a reader might overlook a new alternative title because it was buried between dozens of Marvel comics. While Marvel denied these accusations, this was exactly what they were doing. They were asserting their dominance over both the smaller publishers and their chief rival, DC. Worth mentioning is comic book magazines. During the latter part of the 70s, Warren Publishing did well with Creepy, Eerie, and the solo Vampirella title. DC seemed to avoid this market, but Marvel embraced it. They launched a series of black and white titles, such as The Savage Sword of Conan, The Deadly Hands of Kung Fu, Rampaging Hulk, and the Mad magazine ripoff Crazy. For the most part, these Marvel magazines were simply longer, slightly more mature versions of their color comics. They included healthy amounts of cleavage or the occasional exposed breast, but otherwise, they were practically the same as their comic books. In 1977, Heavy Metal launched and changed the comic book magazine landscape. Its slick production value and adult-oriented stories were a reasonably massive hit. Marvel made its own attempt at a high-quality adult magazine with Epic Illustrated. Rampaging Hulk was also upgraded to color. The stories became more mature, and they were written to attract the audience that was watching the popular TV show. By the early 80s, Warren Publishing went out of business, and Marvel closed down its magazine line. The Epic Illustrated brand would carry on in the form of Epic Comics, a creator-owned selection of traditional comics. Also worth a brief mention is the rise and fall of licensed comics, many of which were tie-ins to merchandise, such as toys. This was another area mostly avoided by DC, but openly embraced by Marvel. There seemed to be no toy or property Marvel wouldn't make into a comic. The most notable is Star Wars. The success of that comic seemed to invigorate Marvel's dedication to licensed properties. While that franchise outlived the Marvel comic, as did the Transformers and G.I. Joe, the opposite was true of many other properties. The Human Fly lasted longer than the career of the stuntman it was based upon. Rom Space Knight and the Micronauts lasted years longer than the associated toy line. Godzilla, Shogun Warriors, and Battlestar Galactica were all short-lived like their associated trend. Naturally, there were licensed properties during the Golden and Silver Age too, and it's something that exists in present day. But it was during the Bronze Age when they seemed to be everywhere all at once, and they were specifically created to capitalize on and generate interest in specific merchandise. Hello again, how are you? Welcome to the end of the video ramble. As mentioned in the first part, this is the second of 3 videos looking at the comic book ages. In fact, I think the next video about the modern age is going to be about as long as the 2 prior videos put together. But you know, it covers 35 years of recent developments, so it's no surprise it's longer and more detailed. In fact, I might even need to split that part into 2 pieces. Now, if I still have your attention, if you're new to this channel, then subscribe. If you're not new, then consider becoming a member. Or if you're so inclined, maybe donate using the thanks link. Oh, and by the way, I need to thank all these fine people you see on the screen now. They've all generously supplied support, and I cannot thank them enough. Everything helps, and, quite honestly, I could really use the support at this time. You know what? Let me ask this. What do you think? Should I keep doing these random thoughts at the end of every video? Let me know in the comments below. Alright, back to the grind. I'll talk at you soon. Until next time.